Tēnā koutou katoa, he mihi nui, he mihi mahana, kia koutou katoa. Hello, welcome, and thanks for joining us for today's Building Code Update 2025 webinar to talk about the recently published building product specifications, as well as the updates we've made to acceptable solutions and verification methods. My name is Katie Symons, and I sit in our Building Performance and Engineering Technical team at MBIE, which looks after the New Zealand Building Code. Some of you may recognise me if you attended the webinar we ran back in June about MBIE's wider Overseas Building Products Work Programme. In that webinar, I talked about the Building Product Specifications, or BPS for short, which is a key part of that programme. That webinar was held while we were consulting on the BPS, and so it's great to be back to talk about where we landed after that consultation with the first edition of the BPS we published a couple of weeks ago. But before we get underway, just a few housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available on our website after today. So if you have to duck out at any time, you can come back to see what you missed. Also, feel free to pass on to any others who wanted to be here today but couldn't make it, so they can view in their own time. You can ask questions at any time using the Q&A function. Where possible, we'll answer these as they come in, and we'll also answer a few questions live at the end. And for today's webinar, we'd like to limit the questions to the building product specifications and the new acceptable solutions and verification methods. So let's get straight into it. First, a quick reminder about the background to this work and how it fits into our wider Overseas Building Products Work Programme. For those of you who watched the webinar in June, you will recall that the building product specifications is one of 3 pathways MBIE has been developing to make it easier to use overseas building products here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. The intention of this work is to increase competition for building products, reducing their costs to support the government's primary objective of making it cheaper and easier to build here. Of the 3 pathways, we're only going to cover the building product specifications today, so we won't go into details about the other 2. They involve other changes within our regulatory system, including endorsing overseas standards and recognising products that have been certified to an overseas certification scheme. There's a lot more information on our website on these other 2 pathways at the link shown here, including the recording and the slides from our webinar back in June, where we step through each of the pathways. If you haven't already, it is worth familiarising yourself with the differences between the 3 pathways. Also worth noting briefly that the building product specification is the only one of these pathways that is currently live. More information on implementation timeframes for the other 2 pathways is expected around mid-September. So please make sure you are signed up to our mailing list to hear about this when it happens. But back to the BPS. One of the drivers for the development of the BPS was acknowledging that a barrier to using overseas products is the wide range of product standards that are cited across our many acceptable solutions and verification methods. So up until now, of the approximately 450 standards cited in our AS and VM documents, about 250 of them were building product standards, and a majority of these product standards, about 140, were single standards for a given product. There were no alternative options. These standards were also spread out across a number of acceptable solutions and verification methods, meaning it was difficult to identify all the standards that a single product must comply with. So, to help support the use of overseas products, we have introduced the Building Product Specifications, the BPS. The BPS is intended to be a central resource for building product standards to be used alongside acceptable solutions and verification methods to demonstrate compliance with the building code. This is intended to provide more options for building products, but not change minimum requirements. The BPS contains product specification information, including citations of product standards that were previously found in acceptable solutions and verification methods. Alongside this product information that already existed, the BPS contains new citations of additional product standards that have been assessed as requiring equivalent or better performance. Acceptable solutions and verification methods can now reference the BPS for information related to building products. When they do this, the specification requirements in the BPS become part of the acceptable solution or verification method. However, the acceptable solution and verification methods must still be adhered to in order to comply via those compliance pathways, and that includes how the specified products are used within the scope of the AS and VM and any limitations. So in other words, you cannot use the BPS in isolation to demonstrate compliance. Just because a building product is made or tested to a standard cited in the BPS, it doesn't necessarily mean that the building work complies with the building code. So we ran a consultation on the draft of this document back in June, and we'd like to thank everyone that took the time to make a submission to us through that process. We proposed over 120 standards for the first edition of the BPS. The vast majority of them, around 90%, were either joint Australian New Zealand standards or were from other overseas jurisdictions, and around half of them were either new or updated product standards. We received 71 submissions in the consultation, which largely agreed with the proposed standards, but we did make some changes as a result of your feedback, including citations to some of the proposed timber and steel standards, and also minor changes to the document's section numbering. And as part of the consultation, we also asked for suggestions of product standards we could consider for including in future editions of the BPS. And we received well over 100 of these, so thank you so much for that. This feedback is really valuable as we are already working on developing the content for the next edition. So, what does the document actually look like and what's in it? Well, if you were to open the document, you'd see something like this. The sections of the document are aligned with how products are specified in building projects. It's deliberately been organised like this rather than by building code clause, because we wanted to create a resource that could be a single source of information for each product. This is so that all the information that a product manufacturer or a supplier needs to know about what their product must comply with is all in one place, rather than being spread out across multiple documents. And if you've had a chance to look through the first edition, the document already, you'll have seen we have sections for many structural products, concrete, steel and timber, as well as products that form the building envelope, cladding and windows. We've also got a section that specifies how plasterboard can be used as part of a bracing element in timber frame construction. We've got a few standards related to the testing of insulation and HVAC products. And finally, we've consolidated all the fire testing standards that can be used for any type of product and put them all in one place, the last section of the BPS. These were previously cited across CAS1, CAS2 and CVM2. So now we've got them all together so they can be easily referenced and, importantly, updated more easily in future. But it is important to note that this first edition isn't comprehensive. The BPS isn't yet a complete repository of building product specification information. Some of this information still remains in the acceptable solutions and verification methods. There are gaps in the document. Some sections even say reserved for future use. So these are placeholders for us to come back to and add over time. And even for products we do have sections for in the BPS, we may not have all the specification information for that product in relation to all the different building performance aspects that product contributes to. And there may be additional requirements for use of the product in Aotearoa New Zealand that aren't related to the building code, e.g. health and safety regulations. We're only dealing with requirements related to building code compliance in the BPS. We do want to provide more compliance options in the BPS to improve its effectiveness. So if you do have suggestions for product standards or specifications that you feel are equivalent or better than our current product requirements, please get in touch. We'd love to hear from you and work together with you to make the BPS more comprehensive. But I'll run through a couple of examples of how the BPS is working to provide more options for products within the existing compliance pathways. So fibre cement cladding is an example of a product that has specification requirements within E2 AS1, an acceptable solution for demonstrating compliance with the external moisture requirements of the building code. The section detailing the requirements for fibre cement cladding in the previous, the third edition of E2 AS1, contained a citation to the joint Australian New Zealand standard AS NZS 2908.2. So only fibre cement cladding products that were made and tested in accordance with that standard could be used in building work that demonstrated compliance via E2 AS1. Now, the building product specifications cites AS NZS 2908.2 in the fibre cement cladding section. But that same section also contains citations to an ISO standard and a European standard for fibre cement cladding products as well. And then the new fourth edition of E2 AS1 references this section of the BPS for the fibre cement cladding product information. So now fibre cement cladding products that are made and tested in accordance with any of those 3 standards can be used to comply with E2 AS1 4th edition. So in this way, the BPS is providing more compliance options, not changing minimum requirements. You can still use products made or tested to the same standards as before, but now you can also use other products made or tested to additional product standards if you choose to. Another example of how the BPS works, the requirements for fire spread on lining materials can be determined in a number of ways. These options were previously spread out across CAS1, CAS2 and CVM2, with much of the same content repeated in each document and some material only located in CVM2. So we've consolidated all this material into the BPS. CAS1, CAS2 and CVM2 all now refer to that section of the BPS. So there's only one place you need to look to find the information for fire testing standards and specifications. This has been done across the suite of fire testing standards, removing multiple duplicated pages of content and providing a central resource for all the fire testing standards. So it is important to remember that in terms of building code compliance, the BPS only provides information on building products themselves and how they must be specified, not about building work. So this could include how the product is tested or fabricated, or any physical characteristics it must have. You still use the existing compliance pathways, the AS and VMs, to determine how the building product must be used in building work to comply with the building code. The introduction of the BPS has not changed minimum requirements set out in those documents. So at this point, it's a good point to segue into the other part of our presentation today, the new editions of the Acceptable Solution and Verification Method documents that were published alongside the BPS. To tell us more about those, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Devin Glennie. Hello, Devin. Would you like to introduce yourself? Tell us a bit about what you'll be talking about today.
Yeah, so my name is Devin Glennie. I'm Principal Advisor at Building Code. So here at MB for the last about 5 or 6 years, I've been working to try and get some consistency across our different acceptable solutions verification methods and help with some of the publishing aspects. So today I'm going to talk about all the amendments that have been made to the various documents to support the BPS and everything else that's been published here a couple weeks ago. To start off with, though, I'm going to talk about another announcement that was made on July 28th, so the same day the BPS was released. We also announced that we'd be looking at a 3-year review cycle for the building code. So this follows along similar trends in other countries where they have a predictable cycle, and that cycle is usually 2, 3, or 5 years, depending on your area of the world. So we're going to be looking at a 3-year cycle. So what does that mean? It means that we're in 2025. We're publishing a bunch of documents this year. Our next kind of major update will be in 2028. This announcement doesn't affect some of the other ongoing work programs we have. So there was already announcements this year around the H1 acceptable solutions verification methods. They're going to be published later this year. That doesn't change. We also have an ongoing fire safety review, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later in this presentation. That's not affected by this 3-year cycle, as well as our continued work to update the building product specifications. That's going to continue as is and as planned. So we're looking at still creating another edition of the BPS in the near future. But what was released this year, we actually had 16 amended acceptable solutions of verification methods. And this is spread across the building code between B1 structure, B2 durability, C protection from fire, E2 external moisture, G4 ventilation, and then H1 VM3, which is a verification method for commercial HVAC systems in commercial buildings. So all these documents were amended because we were looking at building product specifications that were related to these. These new documents were published in a new format, which I'll talk about here in a bit. But essentially, they look different. They're looking a little bit refreshed and all looking consistent. But essentially, the content hasn't really changed. So it wasn't intended to raise the level of performance in any of these updates, but things have changed in terms of how they look and how they're laid out. We are providing a transition period of at least 1 year. So until the 31st of July, 2026, you can continue using the old documents. So what's actually changed at a high level, there's kind of 3 updates to the new acceptable solutions and verification methods. Like I said, they have a new layout. This layout's actually been used since 2020, and gradually we've been updating documents and publishing them in this new format. And in this case, we went and took that to the whole suite of acceptable solutions and verification methods published. There's amendments to reference the building product specifications, like Katie talked about. That's how these product information is now incorporated into the ASMVM documents. And we made other minor amendments that do not affect the level of performance. This basically refers to things like typos and grammar updates and just wording changes to try and get some consistency in the documents. We'd kind of be amiss if we didn't take that opportunity as well to kind of fix the things that we knew were kind of long-standing issues. So I'm going to go through some of this information, but there's also a website where we talk about all this stuff as well. So building.gov.nz/BCU25 or building code update 25. It talks about the same things I'll be presenting here today. So that new layout, if you haven't seen it before, we've standardized a number of things within the documents. The first thing is at the front of the document, along with the new cover page, which talks about the document and when it's effective. We have a preface at the second page, which tells you where the document fits in the regulatory system, what date it became effective, and how long until you can use previous versions. Following that, there's also main changes as well as features of this document. The main changes highlights everything that's essentially new in the new addition or amendment and lists that out in bullet points. And so this replaces some of the other tables that were in our acceptable solution verification methods that just showed what sections had changed. This actually describes what those changes were. There's also a features of the document. It tells you about hyperlinks and italics and comment boxes and how those would be interpreted. And it also, one of the things we've changed the layout is providing consistent structure for all the content. And we've given an example of how that actually works. So as we talk about this today, you'll be seeing that everything is laid out in a similar format, which goes part, section, subsection, paragraph. So part 2, section 2.5, subsection 2.5.3, paragraph numbering starting on that 4th order list. This was trying to get some consistency across the code. We had some documents that were written with only 2 levels of headings. Some were written with 5 or 6. We tried to provide some consistency there, so at least the content is structured in the same way. And it's a lot easier to jump between different documents. You don't have to relearn a whole new format or structure if you're looking at one part of the code versus another. The new layout also has an introduction page, which has the same 4 kind of basic headings for every document. There's an introduction that talks about the scope of the document, items outside of the scope of the document, and the compliance pathway. So it gives you very basic information about what the document can be used for, what things are in scope, what things are out scope, and what part of the building code it can be used to comply with. Some of our documents historically have had none of this information. If you opened up the document, there'd be nothing there at all. It wouldn't tell you what buildings it could be used for. It wouldn't tell you what parts of the code it could be used for. And it kind of is a lot more difficult to use if you have to first figure out what this thing even applies to. So we provided the same consistent level of information for each document. There's other things within that part 1, depending on the document you're looking at. Some of that information may be about how to use the document, some of the basic input data, or there's even sections now that talk about the building product specifications and how they're used for compliance as well. So that's all contained within that part 1, some of the general information about the document. You'll also notice that we've moved appendices to the end of these documents. So we have consistent appendices across each ASMVM. Appendix A, references, and Appendix B, definitions. Previously, these were at the front of a lot of our ASMVM documents, which means you'd have to scroll by them if you want to actually get to the content. One of the worst offenders was probably CAS2, which had about 35 pages of material before you actually got to a single requirement. which if you've already read the definitions once, you probably don't need to reread them every time you're opening it up. It's just a long list to scroll by. So that's been moved to the appendix, and it's in a consistent spot for each document as well. So talking about 4 of those 16 documents, I'm going to go through the order of which documents were least affected by the changes this year to the most affected. So these 4 documents were the least affected. B2 VM1, E2 AS2, that's used for earth buildings, E2 AS3, an acceptable solution for concrete and masonry buildings, and then G4 VM1, so ventilation, verification method for ventilation. These 4 documents are virtually unchanged. We've published them in a new format and split them out in their own publication, but otherwise the content is essentially the same. And they don't actually contain any references to the building product specifications. The reason we split them out is so that we can publish each AS and VM document separately. And keeping with that, these ones were just collateral because collateral damage from the other documents we've changed. So if you're used these documents in the past, you can open them up. You can see that we have that new layout where it provides that information up front. It provides an introduction to the document, but otherwise the content is unchanged. The next level of changes we'll talk about is on the HVAC system. So G4AS1 and H1 VM3. They both contain requirements that relate to equipment for HVAC systems, and they now both reference the building product specifications for those. So you can see that there's 2 examples there in text. In the G4 AS1, there's a section for air handling units to comply with the building product specifications in subsection 7.2.2. And in H1 VM3, you have a similar statement for some pumps, the efficiency of pumps. Pump motors, sorry. And it refers to subsection 7.2.1. So this was what Katie was talking about earlier, is that there's 2 different documents, but they both refer to the general same part of the building product specifications there in part 7. Another thing to note with these documents, some of the colors have changed. People pick that up, but they've gotten a little bit darker. There's some reasons behind that. Suffice to say, it just makes it easier to read with some of that white text. So if you're looking at these G and H clauses, those were the ones that probably changed the most. And then just the colors are a little bit darker, but there's nothing else behind that except to just make it easier to view. G4AS1 had a few more edits than H1 VM3. G4AS1 is one of these documents that had no introduction at all and was kind of confusing in some of its layout and how the content was structured. So to provide some more information about that, we've posted this on our website, which details all kind of changes that have been made to the acceptable solution. It includes a front page that describes those kind of high-level changes, as well as tables that detail out in kind of 3 columns, what the old edition section numbering was, what the new ones were, and any other comments of what was changed. So if we zoom in on that, you can see here that at the bottom of that list, you can see that the 4th edition of G4AS1 was paragraph 151. The new paragraph numbering, now that we've added an introduction to the document, is now 2311. And the comment on that paragraph is that it's been amended to reference the building product specifications. So these documents, these information packs, they provide this information on what's actually changed, what the numberings have changed in the new editions, and they're there to kind of help you transition from the old editions to the new editions in the new format. So if you have things like checklists or templated reports or standard details you might be using, and if you want to know where those have gone, where they shifted between editions, you can use these information packs to find that information quite quickly. You can look for the old number, you can find the new number, and you can find out if anything has changed in that paragraph. So those are all available on our website on that same link, the BCU 25. And we have these information packs for all the longer and more involved changes. So I think there's 10 or 11 of the 16 have these same kind of tables outlining all the changes. If we look at E2 VM1s, the verification method used for cladding systems in buildings up to 10 meters in height, not a lot has changed, but some content again has moved around. So we've provided a standardized introduction. There's two main parts of that document still. One is about wall cladding systems. One is about roof cladding systems. Those haven't changed. We've just reconfigured the content to match that new layout and structure of the content. E2 AS1 4th edition, similar kind of thing. We have not changed the major parts. So if you've used E2 AS1 in the past, you'll note that part 9 is still wall claddings, part 8 is roof claddings. Those have not changed. What we have done is some changes to the introduction section. So previously, I believe part 1 was called scope and part 2 was general, just to fit in our layout and get some consistency across the AS and VM documents. Part 1's general. It contains those general requirements. Part 2 is more about the cladding systems and materials. And also on part 3, there used to be examples. Those haven't gone anywhere except they've been moved to an appendix. So there's 2 new appendixes created. One's on material tables. So if you're familiar with E2AS1 previously, there was just a bunch of tables at the end of the document you'd have to refer to. We've now combined those into an appendix. Similarly, those examples on using the risk matrix, they're now in an appendix D. So instead of having to flip through the middle of the document to find the examples, you can actually just find them in the appendix at the end. Otherwise, we try to maintain the same kind of heading structure and layout to the requirements in E2AS1, recognizing that it's widely used and people got familiar with how it's laid out. Some of the detailed changes here, you can see what we've done here. This is Katie's example from previous, where we talked about fiber cement weatherboards. Previously, that text would have been paragraph 952. It's now 9521. And we've provided that paragraph numbering consistent across the document. Other things we've done is standardize a lot of the headings and introductions to the various sections of the document. Some of them jumped around, and through the number of amendments made to the 3rd edition, there was blank sections of E2AS1. So we've tidied that all up. I made sure that the headings and introductions are consistent. So regardless of what type of cladding you're looking at, it's kind of laid out in the same standard way, at least at the start of each section. There was a number of typos that have been updated and cross-referencing errors in E2AS1. It's probably in the order of 50 to 100 different things that were updated. And these are errors that we knew about or found through proofreading with the new edition. The figures and table numberings have changed. So in the new layout, figures are numbered in relation to the paragraph they're most associated with. So if there's a requirement for a type of cladding, the figures related to that cladding are numbered in the same way. This makes it easier to try to navigate and see where that requirement and those figures are being called up. There was also issues in E2AS1 where some figures were located in a completely different part of the document than what there was relevant. So we've renumbered them and moved the location so that you can actually find them. So if you're reading a requirement, it's actually the figures is there or on the next page or on the in the similar section at least. And some of the paragraphs have been rewritten to use more consistent wording as well throughout the document. There's a number of defined terms in E2AS1. However, not all the content was written to use those defined terms. We've tried to incorporate that where we could. In the comparison here, some of the formatting changes, E2AS1 was probably the biggest offender. It had very inconsistent formatting. So on the same page, you can see on the 3rd edition, it goes 1, 2, 3, 4 on the left-hand column. On the right-hand column, it's now A, B, C, D. If you go on even a couple pages further, it's got a completely different structure as well. Some just use bullet points. So we've tidied all that up. So now it's laid out in the same manner, in the same kind of numbering format, which can help just ease of use in reading these documents. So the content actually hasn't changed. If you look across the 4th edition, those wordings and the way that the requirements in the paragraphs, they have not changed, but some of those numberings have. So again, I would refer you back to those information packs we provided. It tells you where the old numberings are in the old edition and what the new numberings are in the 4th edition. Moving on to B2AS1. So the 3rd edition of this document references the building product specifications for some of the timber requirements. And as well, it's been updated into this new format. With referencing the timber requirements in the BPS, a lot of the content was actually moved from B2AS1 into the building product specifications. This is noted in those information packs. There's a number of instances where it tells you that it's been relocated. So a paragraph hasn't disappeared. The requirement is still there. It's just been relocated as it refers to a product specification as opposed to requirements on how it's used. So these are noted, and if you have any, if you're trying to find this information, look at those information packs, and it can tell you exactly where things have gone. One thing to know about B2AS1, we did pick up a typo here in just the last week. It refers to section 3.6.1 of the building product specifications. This section doesn't exist. It's actually subsection 3.5.1. It's quite obvious because it tells you to go look at this section for 50-year durability, but that section doesn't even exist in the document. And that's a consequence of some of the updates made post-consultation. It was one of these minor typos that just weren't fixed. So this section of B2AS1, just note for now, it refers to the wrong numberings. We'll be trying to update this when we can and try to resolve that issue. But like I said, it's a pretty obvious error because that section number doesn't exist. And the title of the actual subsection it points you to what's the requirement. Now on to some of the more larger changes in the content structure. We're looking at CAS1, CAS2, and CVM2. So these 3 documents are used for compliance with protection from fire. Like Katie mentioned, all references to the fire testing standards have now been relocated to the building product specifications. So a complete removal of all that content, which has some big impacts. There was previously appendices in each one of these documents that outline those fire testing requirements. So those have all gone. They've all been consolidated in the building product specification. So a lot of the repeated text just completely removed from these documents. CAS1 had already been published in the new format in the last update for that document. So there was only minor wordings to reference, or minor changes to wording to reference the building product specifications in that document. However, CAS2 and CVM2 were in their own legacy formats. CVM2 was in a format that wasn't used in any other part of the building code. So we've revised these, put them into the new layout, and simplified a lot of the headings and text in the documents where we could. A lot of the tables were also simplified. They would have multiple lines of merged cells and headings. A lot of those tables can be kind of confusing to use because you've got to overlap between 3 or 4 different columns to figure out which value you're looking at. So we've simplified those tables into just a kind of a standard format. This table is actually making it a lot easier to read just as a user of the documents, but also for some of the other types of computer-aided readers. So if you're using a kind of screen to text or a screen reader, it has a lot better results when trying to use these kind of tables. Same thing if you're using like AI software. So if you've ever loaded an AS or VM document as something like ChatGPT and asked it to give you results and asked it a question, it would have a lot of problems reading those kind of tables. So some of that stuff has been optimized here to looking forward into the future of how this content's used digitally and how it can actually support some of that work. So we made it easier to read for humans, but also made it easier to read for AI software as well. CVM2, there's other changes in the documents where the building product or where the scenarios actually contained a lot of product information. So all that content's been moved over to the building product specifications as well, which changes a lot of those design scenarios. They become a lot more simplified because they're now just referring to the building product specifications instead of outlining all these different ways to do fire testing. Here's some examples of CAS2. Like I said, we replaced all the references to fire testing standards in the document. This is just a few of them, but I think there's a list of about 10 or 12 different locations. So things like the fire resistance ratings, it refers you to building product specifications. Fire stopping systems refers you to building product specifications. Fire doors and smoke control doors, external wall cladding materials, they're all the same. They all refer you to the building product specifications. I think this highlights some of the differences between what the content is in the acceptable solution versus what the content is in the building product specifications. So the fire resistance rating, it tells you how to test it, which is to refer to section 8.2 of the building product specifications. But there's other requirements in the acceptable solution that say what level of FRR you actually have to have. So if you need a 60-minute fire rating for your building, that's still contained within the acceptable solution. The only thing you're getting from the building product specification is all the test standards that can be used to demonstrate that the building element or system actually meets that rating. So the comparison here of just how we've condensed down and simplified these headings. Here's one part, which is means of escape. It had 16 different sections in the previous edition. That's been condensed down to 9. And the headings that are gone, they've just been consolidated into different sections in the document. So some of those things like escape from basements only had a single paragraph, or things like signs only had a single sentence on how to actually, what you needed to comply. And so that's been condensed down into the new edition. The same things happened in part 4 and part 5 of the document, where I think part 4 had previously about 18 different headings. Now it's down to about 12 or 13. And part 5 the same. So kind of restructuring that content to make it a little bit easier to use and easier to navigate throughout the documents. Another thing to note about CAS2, another one of these typos we picked up. This one's actually already been updated. It was picked up on the first day it was published, and it was just simply a formatting error. So table 2211, some of the values were previously showing without the superscripts, which can lead you to a different interpretation of what fire safety systems are actually required. So we've updated that. That's already online. It was changed the same day. If you've downloaded the document in the past, you might just want to re-download it or at least print off for that same page. That's the only page that's changed. If you're loading in your browser, you might have to actually refresh the window before you get the new version, but essentially it's been already updated online. Like I said, CVM2, a lot of the design scenarios have changed. This is just an example of the IS scenario where it was previously about a page of text outlining different fire testing requirements to determine group numbers. That's all been relocated to the building product specifications, and instead the design scenario just refers to the different sections in the BPS where they're relevant. So it's consolidated a lot of the content out of the verification method, which is only necessary for the product testing. Fire safety review. I kind of mentioned this at the start of this section, but we made an announcement last Friday on the next steps of our fire safety review. So in 2024, we consulted on issues in the fire safety provisions in the building code. This is based off a review that we had undertaken, incorporating stakeholder feedback and discussions with others in the industry about what the problems were in the building code. So we put those in a discussion document. We consulted on it late last year. We analyzed the submissions this year, and suffice to say there was broad support for the issues we identified. Issues around the consistency of the requirements, the level of safety being provided, keeping up to date with new technology. There was a number of issues that were identified in the existing building code clauses. So on Friday last week, 8th of August, the government announced plans to change those clauses, and we'll be working on proposed building code changes for CAB to consider early next year. So the announcement here is really that these clauses will probably be changing in the near future, or at least next year, and that the acceptable solution verification methods will have to be updated once new clauses are in place. We expect there'll be a transition period through that as well. So there's nothing on the immediate horizon, but just to let you know that this is kind of the next stages of our review. All right, to end out this section, we're going to talk about some of the B1 documents. So B1 structure, there's 2 acceptable solutions and 2 verification methods. All 4 of these have had updates to incorporate references to the building product specifications. In some cases, it's just minor, it's just a single reference. In some cases, there's multiple different items, but we've incorporated at least 1 reference in each one of these documents. The first thing you'll notice about the new documents is that actually they have new titles, specifically for B1 AS1 and B1 VM1. Previously, they were just called General. So we've actually provided them a title to give them some description of what their content contains. So it's structural provisions for buildings and B1 VM1 structural design of buildings. B1 AS1 and B1 VM1, if you've ever read them, they're quite convoluted. They're just a bunch of modifications to standards, and they've actually existed in the first edition since 1992. So they're basically in that same format, unchanged for 35 years. So with the publication of the new editions, we've taken the opportunity to rewrite and reorganize the documents completely. So they're now focused around 3 different areas in the documents. So there's standards for primary structure, so things around like concrete, timber, steel, aluminum, earth building designs. That's in one part of the document, and then other parts include a section on building elements, so things like windows, glazing, and drains, and then site work as well. And that's actually how the code clause is organized itself. It talks about buildings, building elements, and site work. So we try to reorganize these documents consistently with the way it's outlined in the code clause as well. Going into a little bit more detail here, you can see B1 VM1, it previously had 12 or 13 major sections. Some of those were a sentence, some of them were multiple pages. We've condensed that down, and like I said, it's kind of 3 different sections now: buildings and structures, individual building elements, and then site work. B1 VM1 also has a bunch of inputs on the structural design actions, or the loads they're used. That's also been separated out to its own part as well. So kind of consolidating some of that content to make it a little bit more clear of how it's actually to use the document. The structural design actions haven't changed, so these are still the same loads in the document. So that's kind of the major part of the document. That's unchanged. So the only thing we've been looking at is product standards, and these relate to more of the design side. So this stuff is unchanged. And we provide that overview of what the suite of 1170 standards are used, including their version number and year, and amendments used as part of that. B1 AS1, again, it's been consolidated in terms of its format and layout. It's a little bit more simple than B1 VM1, so there's no section on loadings, and there's no section on site work either. But there's buildings and structures and individual building elements. And again, the major kind of design standards, masonry, steel, timber, earth buildings, those are all recorded and presented in one kind of section of the document. And if we look a little bit more in depth on like some of the changes we made to the layout, B1 AS1 referred to NZS 3604 for timber design, and it had a bunch of modifications. So those modifications haven't changed. They've just been redrafted into a new paragraph kind of layout. One of the things we've done is actually given some of these sections titles. So you can see in the first edition, bracing design had a title, but if you go to the immediate next section, it just says clause 7.4.1.3. So if you weren't really familiar with 3604 or didn't have it memorized, you'd actually have to look up the document to see what that clause was even about. We fixed some of that and just given it a title. So it's about timber decks. So you can know immediately when reading it, oh, these modifications apply to timber decks if I'm using 3604. We've also provided just a short list and introduction to each one of these sections to state what the modifications relate to. So there's a list here in paragraph 2311 in the second edition that states what these additional requirements and modifications are. B1 VM2. So this was previously known as B1 VM4 Foundations. This is a document that's used for geotechnical design of foundations. We've changed the numbering just because there was no VM2 or VM3. They were placeholder titles that have been there since I believe 1992, and there was no verification methods ever developed. So we've simplified it just by reducing some of the numbering and retitle it as VM2. Otherwise, the content has also been restructured. So there's two major parts to VM2. If you're not familiar with the document, it covers foundations, both shallow foundations and pile foundations, and contains a number of equations used to calculate ultimate limit states, as well as dimensions and different loading conditions and moments. So there's over 50 equations in VM2. And previously they were just in big long lists. So you can see in the first edition, there was just bullet point lists of all the different conditions, and it just kept going and going and going. Some of this can be difficult to actually read because there's no numbering associated with any of these bullet points or any of these equations. So we've tried to get a consistent format for this. The first thing we've done is just taken the equations and actually given them numbers. So each equation is now numbered. It talks about the conditions and when to use the different terms. In the pile foundation section, there's actually very similar equations presented for over 13 different types of soil and drainage conditions. And we've actually provided a table that lists out which paragraph applies to which one of those and which set of equations would apply for this situation. Try and simplify the use of the document so you can immediately see, oh, if I have this condition, these are the paragraph I need to refer to. So if you look on the right-hand side there, paragraph 3423, it now tells you about for short restrained head piles, these are the equations you have to use. Those are provided below. We've also provided the notations with those equations. So VM2 or VM4 previously just had one single page that had all the notations for every single equation together, which meant that you'd have to flip back and forth if you wanted to identify a single term. So we've located all those different notations along with the equations they're associated with to try and simplify that process. So you can look at the equation, you can look at the terms, and continue working through the document. All right, well, that wraps up my section here. I'm going to turn it back to Katie, who's going to attempt to summarize 17 documents that we just published and our webinar today. Back to you, Katie.
Thanks, Devin. Yeah, that brings us to the end of the prepared presentation. But yeah, a quick summary of what we have covered. It has been a lot, and I have been trying to keep track of questions. We actually have had a record of attendees for this this webinar, so I haven't been able to get on top of all of your questions, but it's great to see that engagement. So thanks. Please keep sending them in. If we don't get to them now, we will get to them. But yeah, just to summarize, I'll just try and moving on the next page is. Are you able to just fast forward a page, Devin? My finger doesn't seem to be working.
Let's see if we can get to a summary page.
Yeah, there we go. Thanks. So we started out with the building product specifications, or the BPS, the first to go live of 3 pathways designed to make it easier to use overseas products in Aotearoa, New Zealand. It's all about providing more compliance options, specifically for building products used in building work carried out in accordance with an acceptable solution or verification method. It doesn't change the minimum requirements set out in those AS or VM documents. It can't be used on its own to demonstrate code compliance, i.e. just because a product made to a standard in the BPS is used in building work doesn't mean that work necessarily complies with the building code. And this is the first edition of the BPS. It isn't comprehensive yet, and it is intended to be added to over time. We welcome your feedback and suggestions of alternative product standards that could be cited in future editions to improve its effectiveness. And thanks again so much. You know, there's already some suggestions coming in this webinar, so that's great. Moving on to the updated acceptable solution and verification methods. So 16 of these documents have been reissued by MB and have been used to and have been updated to cite the BPS. At the same time, we've taken the opportunity to improve the format of these documents, make them consistent across different code clauses. We've published information sheets for some of these documents, which map out the changes to the content between the old and the new versions. And don't worry, There is a 1-year transition period to adjust to these new additions. The old ones will be accepted until July 2026. There's still something funny with the slide. Sorry, it's not catching up with me. But yeah, having wrapped that up, we can move on to hear from some of you and take any questions that you might have. And yeah, there's a lot of them. Also, just to, before we move on to that, just to note, we're going to put a link into the chat to a survey about this webinar. So we'd really appreciate your feedback. If you're able to, please let us know what you thought about the session. So I've answered some questions as we've gone through, but one of them that kept coming up that I will address now, access to overseas standards that are cited in the BPS. So MB provides access to key New Zealand standards that we cite in our building code. Yeah, we sponsor access to make them freely available. We're not able to do that for standards that are published by overseas standards organisations due to copyright reasons. So any overseas standards that are cited in the BPS, yeah, we're not able to provide access to them. The intention of this of the building product specifications and this work is to provide more options. You don't have to use them, but should you choose to, those product standards are cited. So yeah, that's to that one. Devin, I noticed there was a question, maybe this is a good one for you. Someone was asking about whether our documents and the building code are going to be made available for a sort of AI web application anytime soon. Perhaps you want to talk to that one?
I know there's people out there who've already developed their own free tools to do this. There's nothing that MB is currently working on. However, we're trying to do a few different pilot projects to see how we might support some digital use of our documents, recognizing that PDFs is one format. We might want to actually make these available in other formats. But again, there's nothing here to announce today. That's something that's been in progress for some time now. Yeah,
thanks, Devin. I also noticed, perhaps there's another one for you about fire performance via the BPS. For FRR group numbers, now routed through BPS references, will ILAC accredited overseas fire labs be accepted across the board? How should designers cite reports in consents? Should they do the BPS section or the underlying test standard?
It depends on what kind of products you're using. So if you are specifying individual products, you'd be probably specifying the standard that's used for that specific product. However, we recognize that that's not always the best way to try and consent, because it can lead to issues when there's product shortages. So you can use the BPS is there as a reference to provide multiple options that you can include in your specifications.
Okay, thanks, Devin. There's also a number of people have raised the issue that in the new format of these documents, the building code clause isn't listed within the AS or the VM document. So I recall, I think that was a change that we made a few years ago. The building code clause text is still available on our website. We have an individual web page for each of the code clauses where you can takes you directly to the building code clause itself, but the acceptable solutions and the verification methods are focused on those compliance pathways. Did you want to add anything to that, Devin?
Yeah, so each code clause page has a link to the specific requirements in the legislation. So it's not our intent to republish the legislation. In the past, there's been issues where some of the content in the AS and VMs was not accurate. It wasn't a true version. So to try and avoid that kind of problem, we still refer you to legislation.gov.nz. The preface for each building code or AS and VM document has a link to that legislation website as well. So you can view it there, which is the true version as it's published.
Great, thanks, Devin. And there's also been a few people asking where they can make more detailed submissions rather than in the chat of this webinar about other standards for future revisions of the future editions of the building product specifications. So on that, we're actually working on getting a form link up put up on the page where you can fill in a detailed form to give those to make those detailed submissions. So yeah, we should be getting that up in the very near future. So yeah, if you hold fire for that, you can get in touch with us at any time at building@mb.gov.nz. That will reach us as well. But as I say, this form that will be coming soon should be the portal where you can send us those suggestions. Looking at any other comments.
I saw some questions just in general. They were asking why we didn't update various design standards or other standards in the acceptable solutions and verification methods with this publication. Do you want to comment on that, Katie?
So what's the yes, thanks. Somebody also asked a question about how the building product specification relates to the Amendment Act that passed a few months ago, and perhaps this is sort of related to that question. So in the Act that was passed in April, the Building Act now contains a clause that enables MB to publish the BPS, and it outlines the processes we have to do in order to go through publishing that. It enables us to make changes to acceptable solutions and verification methods in relation to the BPS, but the other content of acceptable solutions and verification methods, there's already an existing process that we have to follow through in order to make updates to those documents. And design standards, ways that, standards that outline how building work rather than building products are carried on, still sit in those acceptable solution and verification methods. And there's another section of the Building Act that outlines the processes we have to go through in order to make changes and update citations to those design standards. It involves more in-depth public consultation where we have to make sure we've thought about the impacts of making those changes. So yeah, that's why we haven't made those changes in this update. And as Devin talked about at the start of his presentation, going forward, we'll be making those types of changes on a regular 3-year cycle. Anything else you wanted to add on that, Devin?
Yeah, just to reiterate, those, like, the intent was not to update all the standards in the acceptable solutions and verification methods with this publication. We're focused only on the building products. So the standards we would refer to as design standards, being those loading standards or other types of system standards, they were not touched, and that's something that was not intended to be touched as part of this update. Yeah,
thanks. Okay, I think rather than try and answer lots of your questions there, as I say, we've had I think a record attendance for a building performance webinar, so great to get that engagement. Thanks so much. I hope the responses we were able to give in the time have been useful. So before we say goodbye, I just want to thank you all for taking time out of your busy day to attend this webinar. Your engagement, questions, feedback, incredibly valuable to us. A final reminder, please refer to the Building Performance website, building.gov.nz, for more information on the BPS and the updated AS&VMs. There are some specific pages that Devin's mentioned already. BCU 25, overseas products, for the wider building products work we're doing. We've also created a short learning module about the building product specifications. If you head to our Building Performance Learning Centre, which you can find on our website, search product to find it there. And yeah, as I said, as always, you can reach us at any time at building@mb.gov.nz. We look forward to hearing from you. Ngā mihi nui, thank you again for joining us today and enjoy the rest of your week.